And it happened again in 2020 when the market crashed in March. Yes, they blame it on some kind of crisis that they engineered. But the Fed again created trillions. And is it any wonder that loads of billionaires were created after the 2020 crisis? Well, that's the Cantillon effect. And that's why we are where we are right now. And populism and the far right is rising. Saturday, July 13th, 2024, Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Some of you, of course, leave questions in the comment section. And recently, one of you mentioned the Cantillon effect, if I could explain that. So that's what we're going to do today. And we're going to look at how the Cantillon effect has led to massive inequality and the rise of populism. We'll put all of those three together. Before I start, though, just wanted to give a shout out to the Dirty Men Safe. And in this day and age of turbulence, and we're going to touch upon this book today, in this age of turbulence, I think it's very important to keep your valuables safe. And yeah, check out the Dirty Men Safe. It's a great way to keep your gold or silver or anything else safe. And make sure you use the link below. You get 10% off and you get a special gift from the Dirty Men Safe. So back to the Cantillon effect. And I think we need to look at who Cantillon was, because I think that's very important, of course, to understand what the Cantillon effect is all about. So you can find it on Wikipedia. Richard Cantillon was an Irish-French economist. He was born in the 1680s and died in May 1734. And his death is actually... There's a question about his death, but we're not going to go into that. And he was the author of Essai sur la nature du commerce en général, which in English means Essay on the Nature of Trade in General, a book considered by William Stanley Jevons to be the cradle of political economy. Although little information exists on Cantillon's life, it is known that he became a successful banker and merchant at an early age. His success was largely derived from the political and business connections he made through his family and through an early employer, James Bridges. And here's the interesting part. During the late 1710s and early 1720s, Cantillon speculated in and later helped fund John Law's Mississippi Company, from which he acquired great wealth. However, his success came at a cost to his debtors, who pursued him with lawsuits, criminal charges, and even murder plots until his death in 1734. So he was a successful banker, and he helped set up the Mississippi Bubble scheme, John Law. And that was a huge operation in money printing or currency printing, because Cantillon differentiated at the time between specie, and specie is basically gold and silver coinage, which is money, and fiduciary media, which he called currency or banknotes. But I'm going to skip here to the part about the Cantillon effect. And then I'm going to go through an article that I found about the Cantillon effect that I think is pretty good and short. And then I'm going to look at how the Cantillon effect has basically distorted wealth distribution massively in the United States. And I'm doing it for the United States because there's very good data for that. But let's go through here what the Cantillon effect is. So it says in essay, and that's how they call his major work. They just call it essay in French. Cantillon provided an advanced version of John Locke's quantity theory of money, focusing on relative inflation and the velocity of money. Cantillon suggested that inflation occurs gradually and that the new supply of money has a localized effect on inflation, effectively originating the concept of non-neutral money. Furthermore, he posited that the original recipients of new money enjoy higher standards of living at the expense of later recipients. The concept of relative inflation, or a disproportionate rise in prices among different goods in an economy, is known as the Cantillon effect. So now we'll skip to this article I found, and I'm going to put a link to it below in the description. I'm going to put a link to Richard Cantillon's Wikipedia entry as well. So this is from river.com, River Learn, Cantillon effect. So let's go through it. They even have a little video that you can watch. I haven't watched it. The Cantillon effect describes the uneven effect inflation has on goods and assets in an economy. Since new fiat, and that's the important part, fiat money or fiat currency is injected into an economy at specific points, its effects are felt by different people and industries at different times. This distorts relative prices and benefits certain parties while disadvantaging others. When new money is added to the economy, it will naturally raise the price of goods and assets. However, not all prices will rise by the same amount or at the same time. The Cantillon effect asserts that the first recipient of the new supply of money or currency or fiduciary media, we have to make differentiate that, because at the end I'm going to tell you what I think the solution is to a fairer, more equally wealth distributed world. And I'm not talking about communism or socialism or wealth redistribution here. Has an arbitrage opportunity of being able to spend money before prices have increased. So here's a little flow chart, so to speak, of the Cantillon effect. The closer you are to the source of money creation, the more you benefit. So who are the people who are closest to the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury? Well, they're the big banks, the big corporations, the politicians, the lobbyists. I would say they are like the top 1%, and the entrepreneurial class. I would say they're the top 10. They're in the top 10%, and everyone else is the bottom 90%, I would say, and especially the bottom 50. And that's why I think we've got populism. We're going to come to that in a minute. Let's just finish this article here. It's not very long. This is partially due to the fact that new fiat currency, and why do I say currency instead of money? Well, because real money, I would say, is specie, gold and silver coin. This is real money here, silver dollar, because you can't really inflate it very easily. Governments don't own, well, they could own silver mines, but they don't. And they don't like working politicians, do they? Banks can thus buy goods at a discounted rate. As the new money flows from central banks to private banks to investors to ordinary citizens, prices gradually begin to reflect the increase in the money supply. By the time the ordinary citizens experience the increased money supply, they will be buying goods at higher prices. Yeah, and not just consumer goods, but things like houses, everything really, cars, businesses, People forget. It's not just the top 1% and the top 0.1% or the top 10% that start businesses. A lot of times, people from the bottom want to start a business, but if you can't, and you also control the political class, they'll make sure that the bottom 90 have no access to the capital. Why? Well, because they're bought and paid for by the people who get the fiat currency first. And I think that's part of the whole populism problem, and we'll come to that in a minute. Thus, the flow of new money or currency through the economy is beneficial to parties that receive the funds first and less beneficial to those that receive it later on. The individuals and institutions closest to the central bank, banks and asset owners, well, Federal Reserve, JP Morgan, BlackRock, think of those guys, private equity, hedge funds, are granted financial advantages at the cost of those least connected to the financial system. The evolution is evident when comparing the wealth increase of the top 0.1% individuals to the M2 money supply growth. So here's the chart. We'll go through this chart, and then we're going to go through some other data that's published by the Federal Reserve Board. So the blue line is the total net worth held by the bottom 50%. So it's first to 50th wealth percentiles. The green line is M2 money supply. That's the inflation, right? Inflation of the currency. What about the red? Well, that's the net worth held by the top 0.1%. So the 99.90th to 100th wealth percentiles, and you can see it matches it almost. It's almost like linked to it. It's almost the same chart. This increase is fully correlated, while wealth held by the bottom 50% of the population has completely fallen behind this growth. As a result of the Cantillon effect, inflation can be seen as a non-legislative and regressive tax on the purchasing power of citizens by the government. Yeah, it is non-legislative, but at the same time, I think it is, because you can only have a central bank monopoly through the legislature, hence the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And as many have said before, there's nothing federal about the Federal Reserve. There's no reserves at the Federal Reserve either. And their banknotes, it's not a real promise, because they don't pay you in anything. They don't pay you in specie anymore. They used to. So what we're going to do now is look further into why the Cantillon effect has really created a lot of inequality in the US. And we're going to look at some UK data as well, because I'm in the UK and I have a lot of UK viewers. But I'm going to put this link in the description, and you can go through the whole thing. It's called it's from the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. And the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., that's the only real part of the Federal Reserve that is kind of linked as an agency of government, but ultimately the 12 regional banks, they're all private. And therein lies the problem for me, when government and the banks get together to control the currency. That's what John Law did back in 1720 with the French king. And Richard Cantillon was a friend of John Law, so he was involved in this. And they opened Bank Royale, and they started this Mississippi scheme. And when there were signs that it was failing, they used to print the fiduciary media. They inflated it, and they got everyone in. Richard Cantillon, of course, was a clever man, and he knew what was going on, and he made a fortune from it. But he also wrote about it. And his book and writings came out only like a few decades after he died. But anyway, what we have here is the distribution of financial accounts, distribution of household wealth in the US since 1989. So I've written a few numbers here that are quite incredible. And after we go through them, we're going to touch upon this man, Alan Greenspan, and why I think he's kind of like the John Law of the last 35, 40 years. Anyway, one of the most shocking numbers here is that in 1989, the top 10% wealth percentile owned 38.06% of all the wealth in the United States. And in 2024, the latest number they have, the top 10% own 66.99, or basically 67% of all the wealth. And I would say that in that top 10%, of course, are entrepreneurs that have done well, but also all the political class, all the military industrial complex, all the bankers, everyone that works in the intelligentsia, I would say, of the United States, the mainstream media, they're all in there. And they don't see a problem because in the last 35 years, they've done really well. They've almost doubled the amount of wealth they have relative to everyone else. So they're doing fine. The bottom 50% also is quite eye-opening, because even in 1989, they didn't really have that much wealth relative to everyone else above them. So in 1989, the bottom 50% had 3.47% of the wealth. And from the latest data in 2024, they're down to 2.49%. So that doesn't seem like a lot, but I think it is. And I think one of the reasons populism is rising is because they're seeing the top 10% do really well. But even worse are the top 0.1% percentile of wealth, and also the top 1%. So we'll go through that. But before we do, just wanted to look at the bottom 90. So everyone below the 10%, yeah, they own right now 33% of the wealth, which is not bad. But they were almost at 40% back in 1989, so they've gone backwards. They were at 39.14%. And the top 10%, the top 0.1, and the top 1% are the only wealth percentiles that have done well. And by well, I mean their proportion of wealth has gone up. So let's look at the top 0.1%. And I guess the billionaires are in there. And whoever else, I don't know. But most probably just the billionaires. They were at 8.56% in 1989 of all the wealth. They had 2.46 times more wealth than the bottom 50%. While as of the latest numbers in 2024, their wealth is up to 13.6%. So an increase of 5% of all the wealth. And now they have 5.46 times more wealth than the bottom 50%. And I think that is part of the problem. That is part of the growth of populism. And what is populism, really? Because people throw that word around, populism, and I always think it's a very good exercise to look at the true definition of words to see what they really mean, because the mainstream media, they vilify populism. They call it far right. And why do they do that? Well, because they're in the top 10, sometimes top 1%, and they're okay. I'm all right, Jack. That's the old saying. But it says here, a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. Notice how it says feel. And I think it's more than a feeling. They know that their concerns are being disregarded by established elite groups. And I'll give you an example here in the UK, and it's a fresh one. The new Labour government, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, recently said, our financial situation is precarious. It's the worst. The Treasury is in the worst shape it's been since the end of World War II. And many people saw that as an excuse for them to not do really more for the bottom 50 or even bottom 90, and to actually raise taxes because the government is in a precarious situation. But then a day or two later, Keir Starmer, who went to the NATO summit, said that the UK is 100% behind Ukraine, and we're going to provide, us taxpayers, £3 billion every year to the Ukraine. So there you go. That's an example. That's why populism is going to continue to rise in this country. And don't be fooled by the new government. They're just the same. They're just a different cheek of the same backside as the conservatives. They're here to serve the top 1%, not you at the bottom 90 or especially the bottom 50%. They'll do a bit of PR and make it seem that they are, but don't buy into it. So let's look at the top 1%. The top 1% is quite amazing as well, because their share of the total wealth in the United States has risen from 22.79% in 1989 to 30.44% in 2024. And they own 12.22 times more than the bottom 50%. And back in 1989, they owned 6.57 times more. So there's the whole reason for populism, in my opinion. Of course, there's a lot of other things, but the fundamental reason is that it's the central bank, and it's the melding of the bankers and government. So let's quickly go through some of the UK wealth inequality numbers. And the Bank of England, of course, does not publish such a detailed report as the Federal Reserve Board. But if you just Google bottom 50 percentile wealth in the UK, it says here, wealth in Great Britain is even more unequally divided than income. In 2020, the ONS, Office for National Statistics, calculated that the richest 10% of households hold 43% of all wealth. The poorest 50%, by contrast, own just 9%. There's more here. The top 10% of households have an average equivalized net property wealth of $480,000, while 33% of households have no property wealth. So that's how the UK is doing. I don't know how that has changed over the last 35 years in the UK, but I would say also in the UK there's a big disparity between London or the southeast and the rest of the country. I saw something that said the other day that if you exclude London from the UK GDP per capita. It's as poor as Mississippi, the UK. So another reason why populism is rising here too. And Charles Lindbergh Sr., who was a congressman, I think from Minnesota, he was an opponent of the Federal Reserve, and he was in Congress in 1913. And this is what he said about the Federal Reserve Act. This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. Yeah, I guess it was a few years removed back then, because in the early 1930s, the U.S. was in a severe depression, and I would argue the Federal Reserve was one of the main culprits with the inflation that it put into the system in the 1920s to help keep the British pound steady. Because Winston Churchill, the chancellor back then, he put sterling back on the gold standard, but at a very high rate. And they had to keep the pound steady, the New York Fed, by keeping monetary policy loose. But I think this gigantic trust has done a lot of damage, especially since 1987. Why 1987? We're going to come now to Alan Greenspan, because I think he is the John Law of our time. And of course, John Law was a Scotsman who went to France, and he got very friendly with all the people at the top, the king, and he started this scheme. He said, you need to print currency or fiduciary media to get the economy going. We'll start this company, the Mississippi Bubble, to explore the riches of the New World. And when it was going bad, he said, well, we have to create a bank and issue more currency to buy the stock. And it all collapsed, and he was driven away into exile. And Alan Greenspan has been a bit luckier, because I just looked up. He's 98 years old and he's still a free man. But one part I want to talk about here in the book that shows you how the central bank, politicians, big corporations, they're all in bed together, and that's part of this Cantillon effect. Can only happen when that happens. So the way to solve the problem, part of the problem of this wealth inequality that Cantillon effect creates, is to abolish the central bank and go back to constitutional money in the United States. And what is constitutional money? Well, silver and gold as well. That's what the Constitution says. And why is it different with silver and gold? Well, because it's the money of the market, of the free market, of the people. Yes, there will always be bankers who try to corner markets and manipulate things. But if they don't have the backing of the law, of government, they have to think twice about doing those kinds of things, because they're not going to be bailed out. And this is the man who started bailing out Wall Street in 1987, the crash of 87, 22% drop in one day in October. He's the famous Greenspan put. And the Greenspan put is still around. What's a put? Well, it's when you have protection, you buy a put option. If the market drops, you have a particular stock, you make money when the market drops because the value of the put goes up. Greenspan instituted the Greenspan put. Is a put that is basically financed by the bottom 90, bottom 50% through inflation. And it's a free put for Wall Street, for the top 1%, the top 0.1%. And the part I want to go through here is chapter 4 called Private Citizens, and it'll show you what kind of friends Greenspan has. I'm sure he's still friends with them. And this is in the period after he left the Ford administration, because he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors from 1974 to 1977. Well, here's where it gets interesting. I found myself in demand as a corporate director, joining the boards of Alcoa, Mobil, JP Morgan, General Foods, Capital Cities, ABC, and more. People serve on Fortune 500 boards for lots of reasons, but the primary reason for me was that being a director gave me a chance to learn the economic workings of things that are familiar, but that I've never fully understood. So he got very well connected to the top 1% or 0.1%. So here we go. Being on the Morgan board was a wonderful opportunity to learn the inner workings of international finance. And here's another interesting part. This is page 81. Even so, I did build up a wonderful circle of friends. Barbara threw me a 50th birthday party at her house. The guests were the people I'd come to think as my New York friends. Oh, here we go. Henry and Nancy Kissinger, Oscar and Annette De La Renta, Felix and Liz Rohatyn. Well, Felix Rohatyn was, I think, the head of Lazard Frères, big private bank, investment bank. Brooke Astor, Joe and Esther Lauder, Henry and Louise Grunwald, Punch and Carol Sulzberger, and David Rockefeller. Who's David Rockefeller, right? I'm still friends with many of these people today, more than 30 years later. So there you go. And what was really the Greenspan put? Well, when you had the crash in 87, I think the Dow dropped 500 points in one day, which nowadays is something that could happen very easily, because we're at 40,000. It would be just over a 1% drop. But back then the Dow was around just over 2,000, so it was a 22% drop. And Greenspan had just taken over as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. And what did he do? Well, he flooded the market with liquidity. He saved Wall Street. And that was that's when the Greenspan put was inaugurated. And we've had Greenspan puts ever since 2008. When all the Wall Street banks were going under, it wasn't like a crisis, an economic crisis on Main Street. It was the Wall Street banks who gambled and wrote quadrillions in derivatives that went sour, and we're seeing firms going bust, and that was going to bring down the whole derivatives house of cards. And Alan Greenspan was instrumental in abolishing Glass-Steagall in 1999 and thus allowing commercial banks to gamble in derivatives. Well, the taxpayer, the bottom 90%, bottom 50% had to come to the rescue to save the top 0.1%. And how come you did that? Well, because the Federal Reserve created trillions out of thin air and bought bonds that the government had to issue to bail out the banks to keep them going. And it happened again in 2020 when the market crashed in March. Yes, they blame it on some kind of crisis that they engineered. But the Fed, again, created trillions. And is it any wonder that loads of billionaires were created after the 2020 crisis? Well, that's the Cantillon effect. And that's why we are where we are right now. And populism and the far right is rising. And you're going to continue to see the top 10%, the media, continue to ostracize these people. But I would say they have a reason for it, because the Cantillon effect and fiat money has brought us to a juncture where things are explosive, not just economically, but socially and even geopolitically. And I don't have a crystal ball to know what's going to happen, but I think we're near the end of this Cantillon effect, and it's going to feel probably really bad for the top 10%, and especially the top 1. Maybe not so much for the 0.01, but I think it's the only way to redress the balance. And I'm not saying we have to confiscate wealth from the top 1% for the bottom 50. No, I think we just need a fairer playing field where government, bankers, and big corporations are not working together, where government works for each individual. Yeah, it's easier said than done. I agree. So there you go. With that, I'm going to wish you all a great weekend. Take care. Bye.